I've always been a fan of more story-driven adventure games, with one of my favorites being the topic for today, the Aceattorney series, with its prequel duology, The Great Aceattorney Chronicles. These two games were initially released in Japan for the 3DS, and for a whole host of complicated localization reasons, it stayed there for years until eventually, on July 2021, it finally released as an HD collection. It's a shame it took so long for this to come over to the West, because in all honesty, this game was easily the best experience I've had with an Ace Attorney game. It breaks the series mold in a lot of great and interesting ways, and the overarching story the duology tells is fantastic with some great characters, especially with the game's main attorney, Ryunosuke Naruhodo, and the always charming great detective himself, Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, no matter what the game calls him, it's pretty obvious who he is, so let's just call a spade, shall we? In this video, he will be referred to as Sherlock Holmes, not Herlock Sholmes. So without further ado, let's go back in time to 100 years or so before the first Ace Attorney with the story of Phoenix Wright's ancestor. It's the late 19th century, and the Empire of Japan's legal system is still in its infancy. Ryunosuke Naruhodo, a budding ace attorney, eventually travels to Great Britain to learn from its legal system to help improve Japan's. Along the way, he'll solve a variety of different cases with the aid of his judicial assistant Susato and the legendary Sherlock Holmes. While I'm skimming on some details for spoiler reasons, that's about right for the premise of the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. The duology is Ryunosuke's journey to becoming a truly great lawyer with the help of his friends along the way. And let me just say, Ryu's friends here are an amazing supporting cast. First and foremost, Susato is the best assistant character in an Ace Attorney game. She's intelligent, resourceful, incredibly charming, and a great friend to Ryu. No other assistant character comes close to her for me. You know, for as confused as Mr. Holmes can get in his great deductions, as we'll get more into a little bit later, he's probably my favorite detective character. He's very well written and hilarious to listen to at points. In fact, on the note of the Great Detective, let's go ahead and talk about how the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles changes the pace of things for the series. Because as an Ace Attorney fan, this game was a breath of fresh air for me in a lot of great ways. Let's start things off with the investigation phase of gameplay, because thanks to Sherlock Holmes, these have never been better. A lot of this phase is about what you'd expect from past games. When you're in a room, you can examine the various objects in it for some flavor text or to find new evidence, as well as chat with anyone present. However, new to this game is Sherlock Holmes' logic and reasoning spectacular. Every now and then, Sherlock will be present in, like, the most random of spots, and he'll give a deduction on a current situation. While he's great at observing and getting to the heart of an issue, he does get a little too excited, as we'll call it, and he ends up fabricating a wild story of some kind centered around what's currently happening. Honestly, these get pretty hilarious at points. Like in one case pretty early on during Chapter 2 of the first game, he ends up coming up with the whole twist in the actual Sherlock Holmes story, The Speckled Band, and you need to correct him on it. Now, that's not the most hilarious example for Holmes stories, but the best ones are spoilers, so I hope this at least gives you an idea of how wacky they can get. As for what you'll actually be doing, it's very simple. At certain points, you'll need to investigate the environment to find what Holmes was going to bring up before his imagination got the best of him. So in that sense, Ryunosuke is sort of like Holmes Watson in this game. Now, it might just be because I've played the game before, but logic-wise, I didn't think any of these were too hard to figure out. All it ever took was a little looking, and I found the solution pretty quickly with them. As for the courtroom phase, we actually have two new mechanics here. You can press a witness's testimony like usual for more information out of any given statement, but this time you can have multiple witnesses at the stand. This gives the testimonies a more dynamic feel to them, since you'll be having multiple people to question, and occasionally they'll get a reaction out of what someone said so Ryu can pursue whatever thought they had to advance the case. And on the note of giving the court cases a more dynamic feel, the jurors add a great extra layer to trials. In the British courts, it's not just the judge you're trying to appeal to, it's also the 6 members of the jury you have to convince for a not guilty verdict. You will, though, inevitably, fail to convince them and end up with a guilty verdict. However, in these instances in the story, Ryu has the right to a summation examination, allowing him to question the jurors on why they made their decision and see about changing their minds. For me, this adds a nice bit of narrative tension to any of the game's trials. Here, they can vote guilty at any point if they feel the defense's argument is lacking. On the note of arguments though, let's talk about this game's prosecutor, because Van Zieks is definitely in my top 3 favorites. Van Zieks as a prosecutor is both merciless and entertaining. He strikes an intimidating presence in every trial he's in, and is just a very well-written and interesting character. To be honest, I think he's the perfect kind of prosecutor to have go up against Ryu, cause with how menacing this guy is, he makes for a great foil for the absolute nervous wreck that is Ryunosuke Naruhodo. He also has a weird quirk involving his drinking, or should I say lack of it. Yeah, this guy's pretty wasteful with his wine in cups. He breaks them, throws them into the lamp, and even tosses the entire bottle at points. Seriously, where is he both getting and keeping all of this? As for the actual cases in each game, I have to say, I don't think there's a single one that I'd say is outright bad. There weren't any sections I thought necessarily had any bad logic behind them, and while the first game has one or two sort of weak cases, I'd still say they're fairly good, even at their worst. In fact, I think I'd go as far as to say the Great Aceattorney Chronicles has the best collection of cases in the series between both games. And with how much there is to say, now's about time to get into the spoiler section of this video, so if you want to avoid them, skip to here. You know, it feels really weird having a spoiler section like 7 minutes into a video, but hey, I guess that's just what happens when you review something that's more of a visual novel than a game. Anyway though, let's get to talking about the incredibly well-written stories in this fantastic duology, and what I feel is the best Ace Attorney experience I've ever had. The cases in the Great Ace Attorney adventure are overall really good, and even do a great job of changing things up. The first case is your normal affair, but the second case doesn't even involve a trial at all. Ryu ends up framed for murder again, and in just an investigation section, he manages to prove his innocence with just a little help from Holmes. Then there's the third case, and while it's also a great tutorial for how British law works, it's notable for the fact that it technically ends on the question of whether the client, Magnus McGilded, was even truly innocent. I mean, it's pretty obvious he isn't, but at the same time, the fact that the game doesn't outright answer that question until later is very different for the series. Like I mentioned before, however, there are a couple of weaker trials here, with those being the first case and fourth case. The first case's problem is that it goes on a little too long. It has some great twists, which does help, but that doesn't change the fact that it drags a bit. Also, the section where Jezile breaks the wine bottle should have immediately gotten her accused of the murder, cause seriously, what innocent person just willingly and knowingly breaks evidence mid-trial? The fourth case is pretty different for this series, in that it actually doesn't involve a murder of any kind. The victim may be unconscious through all of it, but she was just stabbed in the back. She isn't actually dead. However, I could see some people having problems with just how many coincidences were needed for this trial to even happen. But for me, the one weakness it has is that I find the fact that the actual perpetrator of the crime, Mrs. Garadeb, coincidentally also being a juror in this trial, to be a little contrived. Like, could we not have had a bit where Ryu convinces the judge to subpoena her husband and her instead after finding Mr. Garadeb's burned book? I feel that would have been a more natural way of handling it. That being said though, this case does a great job at developing Ryu's character. After the whole McGilded incident, he was left with a lot of personal questions, but this one trial helped him gain more confidence than he's ever had, and paved the way for the ironclad resolve he'd obtained throughout the rest of the story. And despite this case's name, we're totally talking about it because the adventure of the unspeakable story is an incredible final case. It starts off strong with it having a great opening section at the pawn shop with a really good deduction section that does a great job at setting up one of the mysteries for this final case. It also has a really great investigation section, with it eventually leading up to the reveal that McGilded did in fact kill the victim of the third case. Gina's trial, though, is perfectly handled, with it having some great moments and testimony from Inspector Gregson and the Skulkin brothers. Honestly, the part after the trial where Gina cries tears of joy after thanking Ryu for successfully defending her is still an incredibly sweet moment. I gotta say, it also does a really great job at foreshadowing events for the next game, with Iris's manuscript on the Hound of the Baskervilles, and the set of 4 names the group finds on the stolen state secrets. And on the subject of the next game, its cases are somehow better than the first's, with not a single weak trial amongst them. Even the first case manages to be really good. The setup for this one is that Susaito's friend, Ray Bembami, God I love this series puns, has been accused of murdering Jezile Brett, the villain from the last game's first case. Since women aren't allowed to be lawyers in Japan at this point in history, Susaito decides to dress up as a man to defend her friend under the new name Ryutaro Naruhodo. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm pretty sure she made Ray question her sexuality in the process. The second case is actually really interesting, for being the first one to feature attempted murder rather than straight up murder, and the first case where the victim is actually convicted of something along with the culprit. Honestly though, this is just a really good one. Our victim being both a thief and murderer was a really good twist, and for a second trial, Olive's reason for trying to kill him was surprisingly sad and heartbreaking. Then Case 3 came along and decided it would be a great idea if we cranked the quality meter to 11 and decided to never turn it back down. No joke, Cases 3 through 5 are all so good I don't think I could actually pick which one's my favorite. There's a strong argument for any one of them. Case 3 has some incredible twists, with Enoch Drebber not being the one who actually directly killed the victim, though he is just as guilty, and the reveal that not only is Cosma alive, but his father also happens to be the mass-murdering professor. This part of the story also gives some great development for Van Zieks, with it showing off his friendship with Albert, which was honestly really nice to see. On the subject of things that are nice to see, I hope you can excuse my inner dog lover for a brief moment because I need to point out just how adorable Toby is. He is the best little chief inspector, and I love how Gina named him after Inspector Gregson. It's incredibly sweet, but also very sad given what happens in the next chapter. Also, this case has my favorite deduction segment, with Holmes making up a story for how this time bomb is an anti-gravity device. How he comes up with this stuff sometimes boggles my mind, but I love him for it. Then we have the game's two-part final case, and god is it incredible. Ryu and the rest of the gang are easily at their best here, and as a wrap-up to the duology, it's fantastic. Some of the game's best reveals are in these two chapters, and I love how it ends with Kazuma as our opposing prosecutor. It perfectly shows off just how much Ryu's grown since the start of all of this. I mean, look at this man's confidence. He started this journey as nervous as an introvert with stage fright, and now he's got the steely resolve and demeanor to rival the best of them. Also, Holmes showing up at the end with him somehow having invented hologram technology to tell Strongheart that the Queen heard the entire trial is an incredible moment for me. But seriously though, how did this man make this? Because I'm pretty sure this isn't elementary. I can't praise this story enough. It has some of the best writing in the series and some of its best characters. There are so many other little things or moments I haven't even brought up at all that help make this story absolutely incredible. If you are a fan of games like this, you 100% owe it to yourself to pick this game up. For $40, you're getting about 60 to 80 hours worth of peak Ace Attorney. These games give a fresh feeling to the Ace Attorney series with how differently they handle the story structure, and mechanics like the juror system and Sherlock Holmes deductions are very welcome additions. At this point, I have no idea when Ace Attorney 7 will be announced, but what I do know is that it's got a pretty tough act to follow, cause I'm gonna be real with ya. I have no idea how the guys at Capcom are gonna top this. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.